Welcome to the Explainer, everyone. Okay, today we're unlocking something literally game-changing. I'm sure a lot of us have been there, right? Struggling with a new language, maybe grinding through years of classes only to barely be able to string a basic sentence together. Well, what if I told you that you could master any language in just 6 months? Seriously, 6 months. Today, we're breaking down an incredibly bold, systematic framework developed by psychologist and educator Chris Lonsdale. He absolutely insists that fluency isn't about natural gifts. Nope, it's about applying very specific psychological principles. So let's dive right in and see exactly how he built this system.
This whole journey really kicked off with one fascinating question. How can you speed up learning? And for Lonsdale, this wasn't just a passing thought. It turned into a lifelong obsession. Actually, get this. When he was just 11 years old, he literally wrote a letter to researchers in the Soviet Union. He wanted to know all about hypnopia. You know, sleep learning, playing tapes by your bed while you snooze. Now, okay, sleep learning turned out to be a total bust, but that early curiosity just completely opened the doors to decades of intense research into hacking human potential and figuring out how our brains actually absorb information.
And you know what? All of that research paid off in a massive way. Back in 1981, Lonsdale took himself to China. At the time, conventional wisdom completely dictated that a Westerner could study Chinese for 10 years or more and never really get good at it. But Lonsdale, he took all that psychological research he'd gathered and applied it directly to his own learning process. The result? In just 6 months, he was fluent in Mandarin Chinese. 6 months. He argues that human progress is all about expanding our limits. Think about it. We once thought running a 4-minute mile was literally impossible. We thought heavy stuff couldn't fly. And now we have flying cars and wingsuits that let humans glide through the air. You can even learn to draw in just 5 days if you apply the right rules. Learning a language is exactly the same thing.
Now, right off the bat, this completely dismantles our absolute biggest excuse, talent. We constantly hear this myth that you need some sort of innate natural talent for languages. Well, let me tell you about Zoe. Zoe was an Australian who moved to Holland, and she was trying to learn Dutch. She was failing terribly, actually became super depressed, and people literally told her she was useless and just lacked talent. But then, she found Lonsdale's principles. She moved to Brazil, applied the exact framework, and within 6 months, she was entirely fluent in Portuguese. The takeaway here? Strategy completely beats talent, every single time.
Okay, so there's a second major roadblock, another myth we need to completely crush right now. And that's the idea of immersion. We always hear that the best way to learn is to just drop yourself into a foreign country, right? But think about it. A drowning man cannot learn to swim. If you don't speak a single word of the language, you are essentially a baby. Dropping an absolute beginner into a sea of adults talking way over their head, it simply doesn't work. Just look at the expats who have lived in Hong Kong, America, or Canada for decades and still don't speak the local language. Immersion, purely by itself, is definitely not the magic answer.
So, if talent and pure immersion aren't the answer, what actually is? Well, here is the roadmap for our explainer today. First, we'll cover the 5 principles of learning, and second, the 7 actions for fluency.
Let's start with part 1, the 5 principles of learning.
All right, principle number 1 is all about focus and relevance. Imagine you're walking through a forest. Step 1, you see some little marks on a tree. You might pay attention, you might not. Step 2, 50 meters later, you see giant footprints. Okay, now you're definitely paying attention. Step 3, you spot a bear. Suddenly, those marks and footprints become incredibly important, right? Our brains are wired to only pay attention to and actually remember information that is related to our survival or our personal goals. Basically, if the language content isn't directly relevant to you, your brain simply won't retain it. Which brings us perfectly to principle 2. Use your language as a tool to communicate right from day one. Let me share a quick story from Lonsdale. He had a colleague who spent 9 solid months in night school just trying to learn how to type in Chinese. And she failed. But then, a crisis hit. They had exactly 48 hours to deliver a training manual in Chinese. Guess what happened? In 48 hours, she totally mastered Chinese typing. Why? Because the tool suddenly became highly relevant and absolutely necessary to create value. You have to use the language to communicate immediately. This builds right into principle 3. Based on the researcher Stephen Krashen's work, comprehensible input completely outperforms formal grammar study. It's not even close. When you understand the message first, you actually acquire the language unconsciously. Lonsdale experienced this firsthand during his second week in China. He spent an 8-hour train ride talking to a train guard who basically just used pictures, hand gestures, and facial expressions.
Lonsdale understood it piece by piece, and 2 weeks later, he realized he was unconsciously understanding the Chinese conversations going on all around him. Comprehension is the absolute key here, not memorizing grammar rules.
And that brings us to Principle 4, physiological training. Did you know we have 43 muscles in our face? Speaking a new language is quite literally a physical sport. Lonsdale talks about a Taiwanese student who got straight A's in English grammar, but when he arrived in the US, he was completely English deaf. Our brains just naturally filter out unfamiliar sounds. To learn, you have to coordinate those 43 facial muscles to actually make sounds that other people can understand. Honestly, if you're practicing a new language and your face doesn't physically ache at first, you simply aren't doing it right.
The final principle, Principle 5, is all about your psychophysiological state. Look, if you are sad, angry, or worried, your brain blocks learning entirely. Period. You need to be happy, relaxed, and above all, tolerant of ambiguity. This is huge. If you're the type of person who goes crazy trying to understand 100% of every single word, you're going to block your own progress. You have to embrace the unknown. Pay attention to the parts you do understand, and trust me, you will learn rapidly.
All right, moving right along to part 2, the 7 actions for fluency.
Action 1 is what Lonsdale calls brain soaking. You literally just must listen a lot. Put yourself in a context where you hear tons of the language and it doesn't even matter if you understand it yet. You're just soaking in the rhythms and the repeating patterns. Then, combine this immediately with Action 2. Get the meaning first. Human communication relies heavily on body language. Look at people's postures and their gestures to comprehend the underlying message before you even know the vocabulary. Next up is Action 3. Start mixing. Think about the number 1,000 for a second. If you know just 10 verbs, 10 nouns, and 10 adjectives, you can mathematically generate 1,000 different phrases. Language is fundamentally a creative process. Think about how babies communicate, right? They'll say something like, "me bath now." It's definitely not grammatically perfect, but hey, it works perfectly to get the point across. Get creative, start mixing your words, and focus on real communication over perfection. And speaking of those words, Action 4 is focus on the core. This is wild. Just 1,000 high-frequency core words cover a massive 85% of anything you will ever need to say in daily communication. And if you bump that up to 3,000 words, you're at 98%. Fluency becomes highly achievable once you stop worrying about all the obscure, complicated words and focus entirely on this core content. So, how exactly do we sequence all this? Well, in week 1, you learn toolbox phrases in your target language. Essential things like, "How do you say that?" or "I don't understand." You use the language as a tool to learn more of the language. By week 2, you move to simple nouns, pronouns, and verbs, words like me, this, hot, give. Then, by weeks 3 and 4, you start adding what Lonsdale calls glue words, words like but, although, and therefore. These tie your simple words together to make complex, logical meaning. Literally by week 4, you are genuinely talking. Now, to support the speaking, Action 5 is absolutely crucial. Get a language parent. This is someone who communicates with you in a safe environment, exactly like a parent instinctively guides a toddler. They work hard to understand you, even when you sound totally off. They never ever correct your mistakes, which we all know just kills confidence. Instead, they feed back their understanding to confirm the meaning. And finally, they reply using words they know you already understand. It creates the ultimate safe space to learn. Action 6 brings us right back to those 43 facial muscles we talked about earlier. Copy the face. You really need to carefully observe native speakers. Watch exactly how their mouths move. If you let your unconscious mind absorb exactly how their facial muscles coordinate to produce those understandable sounds, you will naturally begin to mimic them. You hear how it feels, and you feel how it sounds. Finally, we reach Action 7, and honestly, this one is a real game changer. Direct connect. Most people use rote memorization. They take a word in their mother tongue, translate it in their head, and try to memorize the target word. This is painfully inefficient. Instead, realize that everything you know is already tied to an image or a feeling. When you say the word fire, you instantly smell smoke and hear crackling. Direct connect means linking the new foreign sound directly to those existing sensory images in your brain. It's the exact same mental box, just a different pathway to get in. You completely bypass that clunky mental translation. So there you have it. We've broken down the 5 principles of learning and the 7 actions for fluency. Every single one of these steps is entirely under your control as a learner. There is absolutely no magical natural talent required. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought.
With this roadmap right in your hands, which language will you conquer in the next 6 months? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, keep pushing those limits, and I'll catch you next time.